All right, Chris, we're talking today about counting the stars with in an empty sky and a name that I always forget. And we were chatting a little bit beforehand, so I feel like I'm actually pretty excited as to where this goes because we kind of cut off a little bit so that we would still have some stuff to talk about, I think. But
Right.
as per usual, I'm gonna pass it your way and just kind of see where you want to start with.
Well, so it's interesting. Count the Stars is I don't know how aptly named it is. I know that's kind of
Hmm.
um, a common sort of memory trick for the Abraham story, right?
Yeah.
Um, and that's memorable for sure.
Hmm.
But really, the whole thing is kind of about blessings and about how God, I guess, has many methods and many ways to bless us. And he meets us where we're at, and he also calls us to where he wants us, right? So it's both things.
Yeah.
It's he meets you right where you are, but he calls you forth also, like come up here and I will show you, right?
Yeah.
So that whole story, to me anyway, kind of starts with, hey Abraham, go to where I'm going to show you.
Right.
And I was always mystified by that because then Abraham just packed up and went. Now I resonate with that because not that I was ever nomadic, but I as a younger man was that guy. Like, hey man, let's go. Okay, let's go. Let's do it. Let's go. And Abraham clearly trusted God to lead him to a place that was, going to be fruitful.
Yeah.
Um, and and so that's faith. Then that's faith in the blessing. Like I don't know where I'm going, but God's going to take care of it. It's going to be good. It's going to be better. It's going to be good to obey. It's going to be good to follow Him. I'm going to do
Yeah.
this. It's going to be cool. So, but then later, I mean, we see all kinds of times when Abraham struggles with doubts about other kinds of blessings, right? So, well, your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars. Yeah, but I'm like 100 years old.
Right.
So,
Right.
you know, and so maybe to Abraham, it wasn't preposterous for God to say, get up and go, we're going to move.
Right.
But it was somehow more preposterous for Abraham. Maybe he'd been thinking about descendants forever. Like, I don't have any, you
Yeah.
know? And, maybe it's all my relatives, all my neighbors, everybody's having kids. I'm not having any. I don't understand. And then God speaks something that sounds absolutely ridiculous, right? Yeah, you don't have kids and you're 100, but your descendants are going to be the linchpin to everything that I do.
Yeah. And what man, what gets so diff there's multiple areas to this, so I'm trying to even like track my thoughts in
Right.
terms of because one of the ways, I mean, Abraham makes mistakes throughout the process, right? So he does
Mm-hmm.
go, but he makes a lot of mistakes throughout the process and pursues other things that he has faith in or he trusts,
Mm-hmm.
whether that's himself or, he does other things that God isn't calling him to do, and he kind of pays for it to some degree, but it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't stop the blessing that God promises, right? So like when he
Right.
goes through Egypt, he lies about his wife, right?
Yep.
And there's just different things that come up, when obviously too, when God promises him a son, he's like, well, maybe not through Sarah, so I'm going to try and do it myself, right, and create a son a different way.
Right.
And so he has in his mind this blessing that he wants, or that he thinks God is promising, and he's going to try to accomplish it in a different way, by not following God. And I think about how often that happens, with me or with maybe working in a church, but also just having a family where it's like, okay, let me provide in the way that I think makes sense. And that might include avoiding or not following God's will quite as much as I should. right? And I can't necessarily think of a good example of it right off the bat, but
It's interesting how, I mean, this is a biblical story over and over again,
right,
right? The impatience of the supposedly faithful person, right? Abraham's faith is what God counted as righteousness.
right,
And yet Abraham's the one who couldn't wait for Isaac, couldn't wait for God to do it.
right,
And so he goes and, fathers Ishmael.
right,
And God provides for that situation, but doesn't bless it,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Keep going with that.
So another archetype for that kind of thing is Saul. And when Israel they're demanding a king, and God says, "But I'll be your king."
Yeah,
And they said, "No, we want a real king."
yeah,
Can you imagine? God, you're God, but we want a real king.
right,
And so he tells Samuel, "Okay, let him pick. Let it be the way that they want it." And they choose Saul. If you remember, it's because of the way he looked.
right,
Right? Big and strong and handsome and whatever.
right.
And God never once says, "This is my guy." Right?
Interesting. I don't know if I ever realized that.
Oh yeah. Look through the narrative. Finally, when David becomes anointed, is the first time God says, "This is my king."
Hmm.
Yeah, so Saul is provided for, right? And through Samuel, God speaks with Saul. So again, provided but not blessed.
Well, that's what I love, and I thought you were going a different direction with this. So remind me to come back to.
We can, yeah, it's good.
Well,
But
well, just no. Remind me to come back to he blesses even when we don't follow, right? So just remind me to come back
for
to that
sure.
because another story that happens with Saul and Solomon is Saul. They're about to go and fight a battle. They're going to fight a war, or a
Mhm.
battle, I'll say, and Solomon says, "Hey, wait for me, and I'll do this sacrifice." And the time gets closer, and the time gets closer, and then the time actually passes because he says something.
Oh, you
like,
mean
"Wait."
Samuel?
Yeah, did I say Solomon?
Yeah,
I meant Samuel.
you mean Sam? Yeah,
Yeah, I
Samuel.
mean Samuel. So he's waiting for Samuel, and Samuel doesn't quite show up right at that exact time. And Saul says, "Man, a bunch of people are leaving. We're going to lose this battle if people leave. Let me do the sacrifice myself."
Right.
Ultimately, what tears the kingdom from his hands, right?
Yep.
But Saul, by every logical kind of worldly perspective, Saul does the right thing, right? People are leaving. You want to add, enthusiasm, energy. You don't want people to leave. You want people to be excited, feel confident that they're going to win. So you do the sacrifice. But he didn't follow God, right? He didn't listen to what God was saying. And that I think is an area that I relate to heavily, where it's like, but all this stuff makes sense. It makes sense. It makes sense, right?
Mhm.
This makes sense to me. But if it's not what God is saying to do, then don't do it, or maybe wait for him to say something. And I recognize this issue gets complicated. But what I love is coming back to that point about God's blessings. God is so magnificent, right? That he loves this world. And even though Abraham doesn't do exactly what he's supposed to do, even though Saul doesn't do exactly what he's supposed to do, even though David doesn't do exactly what he's supposed to do, he still blesses all people, and he still chooses to bring Jesus, right? He never says, he never lets that or those things that they're doing stop him from loving people, even stop him from loving them, right? He still blesses. And I just, that is so amazing to me. And that's really, like you said, it's the story of the Old Testament, right? It's the Israelites over and over. They turn from him, they come back to him. They turn.
Yep.
And I think sometimes for me, and then I'm going to turn this over because I'm chatting a whole bunch here, but
You're good.
sometimes for me, I start to think that I I make my own life good, right? That
Hmm.
I kind of deserve it maybe to a degree more than other people deserve it. You know, they make bad decisions, I make good decisions, right? I deserve a good, happy life. They don't. And that's pretty, I think, well, it's definitely egotistical and proud. Um, you know, what we have comes from God, right? And those blessings that I have all come from God. And so the
Yep.
idea that I would be, um, better than somebody else, or that I guess maybe the idea that I make my life good and I don't need God to have a good life is just insane, you know?
Well, and then there's the kind of extreme of, see, again, there's a thin line of faith, right?
Right.
To be obedient and to let God drive. There's a thin line because you've got what you just mentioned, and then the other side of it is um, even false humility mixed in there. I'm so blessed. I don't know why God does. I don't know.
Right.
You know what? I'm better than I deserve, which is entirely true.
Right.
We're getting better than we deserve, but it's because of His goodness. So you're not standing in a blessing because you found the right place to stand.
Right.
You're standing in a blessing because God said, I'm going to bless Zach right now.
Right.
I'm going to do that. Now, let's understand, I'm not saying that God is withholding anything,
Right.
ever. I'm saying God's good. God's heart is for your good always.
Right.
The word does say He gives and He takes away, and we don't understand blessing. We were talking about this before. We
Yeah.
don't understand blessing well enough to understand that taking away is also blessing.
Well, that was an avenue. We were talking about this a little bit before, how we work to our own blessings, right? And
Mm-hmm.
how we try to get it ourselves. I guess going back a little bit to what Abraham was doing, he said, I know how to be happy. It's try and create Ishmael with Hagar, right? I know how to make this thing work. And so we pursue all these different things, right? I know how to be happy. I just need to have so much in my savings account. I know how to be happy. I just need to have so much in my retirement. I know how to be
Right.
happy. I just need to work really hard and then I'll win this thing. I'll get this prize. And my thing is, forgive me if I've talked about this before, but my thing is approval from people, right? I'll
Mm-hmm.
work really hard. I'll be really friendly and everybody will like me and then I'll be happy. I'll have the blessing that, I want. And God is pretty clear, right, about seeking the approval of men versus doing what's right and doing what's good, and those things don't always line up. Sometimes you do everything right and people don't like you, right, or they don't. They you look at Stephen, right? Stephen did everything right and he was stoned to death,
Mm-hmm.
um, and just look at a lot of people in the early church, and I think my only point with that is just that you know sometimes God does take those things away, right? Or you go for that goal, you don't achieve it, or you do achieve it and you realize it's empty, right? Maybe
Mm-hmm.
everybody likes you, maybe you win the prize, maybe you get the promotion, and then you say, I'm still not fulfilled. This
Right.
blessing isn't what I thought it was.
Well, and there's the reason the blessing isn't what you thought it was. Let's look at Paul for a second. Paul says all kinds of preposterous stuff like, count it all as joy.
Right. Not
Count
really.
it all, right? Count it all as loss, right? He says these things. Well,
Right.
why does he say them? Because he understood, and I'm convinced, the more I read, the more I try to understand, the more convinced I am that Paul understood that the pursuit of God was the point anyway. The
Yeah.
pursuit of blessing is wrongheaded,
Yeah.
right? And the point of blessing is to be blessed, for God to be generous and for us to be blessed. But we still need to pursue God. That's the razor edge I was talking about. That's that little window, right?
Oh,
Neither here nor there, right? But it's right down the middle of faith pursue God. And then you and I talked earlier about, I'm sorry, we often say we talked earlier. I'm gonna go back to what we were talking about, which was being unfulfilled by pursuit of anything,
Yeah.
whether it's a cup of coffee, your favorite,
Yeah.
or it's a car or a house or grandchildren or a football team, or I
Right.
mean, put anything on the altar,
Yeah.
anything,
Yeah.
right? The pursuit of any of that stuff is unfulfilling at best.
Right.
Could be idolatry,
Right.
but
Right.
even right, but it's just unfulfilling. And so then here's what we were saying before was name the times in your life when you were fulfilled.
Yeah.
Guaranteed it was a time when you laid down your life for the thing that God said to do.
Yeah.
When you walked in obedience,
Right.
you had an incredible infilling of the Spirit, this sense of, oh, this is exactly what I should be doing, even though probably in most cases you walked into that going, I don't know if I want to do this. But God said, go. And you did. Each of you can reflect on this. You know you did it. There was a time in your life, 2 times, 5 times, a dozen times, when God said, how about this? And you're like, I don't know. And then you did, and you never felt better. And it didn't matter what the blessing or the reward was, because the reward was you did what God said, and He filled you.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, and that's a really good spot for us to end. I think you really hit the nail on the head.